Matthew 25:41 is where he says, and this is a passage, whatever you did to one of the least of these, you did to me. Jesus says to those who do not feed the hungry and clothe the naked, he says these words, "Depart from me, you cursed, into the eternal fire, prepared for the devil and his angels." You don't feed the hungry or clothe the naked, then Jesus says to you, depart into eternal fire. So maybe this is not just about other people who were concerned about fire. Maybe there's a concern that needs to be had in this room about eternal fire. I don't believe I'm overstating this. Not based on the words of Jesus. Now follow me here. Follow me. We're going to dive into this passage, but just suffice to say at this point, this is not a passage that is teaching. It's undercutting the rest of Scripture and saying anything different than that. Salvation is by grace alone, through faith alone, in Christ alone. Period. We know that. Scripture. No question. But I want you to think back. Remember we spent some time in 1 John looking at assurance of salvation, the fruit of Christ in our lives. Remember we talked about that? We said if the love of Christ is not in someone, then there's reason to question whether or not Christ is in someone. If the truth of Christ is not in someone, if they're speaking lies about Jesus, then there's reason to question whether or not Christ is in there. If someone is walking in disobedient, persistent sin and does not turn from that sin, what we talked about, remember, and I would even say again, if you were here this morning, you were to come to me, and you were living in willful, disobedient sin against God, and you were to say, but I'm a Christian, I would look at you and I would say, based, I believe, on the authority of Scripture in 1 John, I would say, amongst other places, I would say, I do not know whether or not you are saved. It is certainly not my place to determine that. At the same time, I would encourage you to ask very seriously whether or not Christ is really in you if you are living in deliberate disobedience to Him. If there is deliberate disobedience in your life that is persistent, there's reason to question whether or not Christ is in you. So bring that into this picture. If this is what Jesus' Word says, and we live with so much stuff, then there's reason to question whether or not Jesus is really in us. This is huge. It's a blind spot, really. That's kind of, as I've been thinking and praying through this, it's a blind spot. And here's what I mean by that. 200 years ago, there were seeming men of God who were preaching the gospel. And they had slaves. We sit here like, how could you have slaves if you're preaching this gospel? Makes no sense. It was a needed corrective. So of course they shouldn't have had slaves. Not if they believe this gospel. Not if they preach it. I wonder if 200 years from now, if Jesus has not come back, if they will look back at us and they will say, how could they follow Jesus and have so much stuff? How could they know this gospel and live in such nice houses and drive such nice cars and have such nice clothes and things? This is the blind spot that Christ has been opening my eyes and my heart to